evening. Welcome, everyone, to another Clear Mountain Wednesday evening session. This evening, we have Ajahn Sdaro back. Welcome, Ajahn Sdaro. Good to see you.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Yes. Yeah, this week, we'll have one of our conversation style Dharma explorations. And we do this in the form of finding some kind of Dhamma quality in another one, and basically oftentimes looking at things which seem somewhat disparate, or which it seems like actually the relationship seems clear, but then upon further examination, maybe it's not so clear, or we can kind of test things out of this, what the relationship really is. So Ajahn Sdaro and I have been talking about this topic of the relationship between morality and meditation. So finding morality in meditation. And Ajahn Sdaro has written a number of papers for different journals and is in the process of editing these. Last week in my interview with him, we got a little bit into his essay called Vows Without a Self. And this week we'll go more into this similar topic of virtue, morality, ethics, but looking at it in terms of the effects on meditation. So the names of his talks are, Does Meditation Make You More Moral? Or Does Meditation Make Us Moral? And another one, which I think is pretty interesting, Contemplative Morality, a Functional Framework. I think there's a lot to kind of understand in that. So that's a bit of an introduction. And Ajahn Sdaro, would you be willing to speak more either about what got you interested in this confluence of subjects, or what your take is on it?
For sure. I think it is a really interesting topic, just because as meditators, and especially as Buddhist meditators, we have this underlying assumption that in some way, the more you meditate, the more moral you're actually going to become. It seems to be hardwired into most people's conceptual view of what meditation can do, that in some way it's going to make you more compassionate, more kind, more pro-social in many different kinds of ways. So I think that that's a really interesting topic, because there's while we have a millennia long framework of the relationship between these two concepts, there's actually not that much empirical work that's been done on the relationship between meditation and morality, which is astounding, because as I said at the start, meditation and morality seem like they're so intertwined when we get on the contemplative path or the Buddhist path. So there's actually not that much research in this field. And the research that is there, it's in a way, it's a little bit inconclusive. And if you start to pass out different aspects of morality in some way and look at what meditation does to that, there's some surprising things that you find there. So actually looking at this from not only from my own perspective of practicing a lot of meditation and realizing the benefits of having some kind of ethical life and ethical framework, and what that's actually done for my own meditation, and always just assuming that the more you meditate, the better your morality becomes, the easier it is for you to get into these nice states of mind through meditation. Knowing that that's a part of our practice, but then actually looking at the empirical field and going, well, actually, is that the case? So it really just interests me in the empirical side of things.
Yeah, it's useful to have data and have studies from like a Buddhist framework. I mean, we've got the Eightfold Path, like right view and right thought, which are kind of headed under wisdom, the rubric of wisdom. Then you've got right speech, right action, right livelihood under the rubric of virtue and morality, and then right effort, right concentration, and right samadhi or right concentration under the rubric of samadhi. And there's this phrase which comes up a lot in high circles that, there's a name of a book by Ajahn Mahabua that wisdom develops samadhi, and samadhi develops wisdom. That's part of the trope. And I think you're right that there's just then the underlying assumption that somehow morality, that there's also a relationship between those three moral aspects of the path and the cultivation of wisdom or meditation. But it's not really clear in a Western context in which the empirical work is being done. One, what is morality? What is the morality that these different people are researching, and what is the meditation? I mean, there are many different meditation objects which might have different effects on one's prosocialness versus, aspect towards actually separatism or detachment. So.
Yeah. And that's a really good point that you bring up, that there's many different types of meditation. That's actually something that's not really reflected in the empirical literature. It's all most of the majority of it is mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation practiced in a secular context. So that's what the empirical literature is looking at. There's been some studies done with like loving kindness and compassion, but there's just not that much there. So yeah, you obviously have these different kinds of meditation, and people are really practicing. Really practicing different styles of meditation. You talk to any meditator, and none of them will say, "I practice this one particular thing." They're practicing many styles, many different traditions. And also, what's interesting as well, I think, is something else you brought up of like, well, what actually is morality? I mean, morality does change over time. What we consider as moral now maybe wasn't moral 10 years ago, kind of thing. And if you look even further back throughout contemplative history, what was moral then is very different from what is moral now. We can see that, you've probably noticed that a lot as well in the Vinaya. We have things in the Vinaya that it's like, well, does that really make any sort of moral sense now? But it was obviously very important at the time. So having looking at the different kinds of morality as well, I think that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. So you say you're mostly looking at mindfulness meditation? Because I would think there would be, I mean, again, this is an assumption that I'm making, that there would be a correlation between, say, loving kindness meditation and, the aspect, development of morality, in the sense that if you're going to define morality as harmlessness towards others and, well-wishing towards others, and then action based on that, then it seems like there would be a very clear relationship between loving kindness meditation and that type of morality. But are you researching other type? What is the scope of?
So yeah, just to clarify, what I meant by the previous statement was most of the existing literature that's there now has looked at mindfulness meditation, and that really actually is a big drive of mine, of looking at all these different kinds of meditation and seeing if your morality changes if you predominantly practice one of those. So I am trying to look at a lot broader range of meditation practices. What a lot of my research looks at is the different time periods you've been practicing meditation, how long you've been doing it for. Do you practice meditation within a particular spiritual tradition, or in a more secular form? Also, if you do practice it within or without a tradition, do you adhere to that ethical framework of that tradition? Because obviously, if you think of this from a Buddhist perspective, if you're the average kind of lay practitioner, they might be very inspired by Buddhism and Buddhist practices, but maybe they haven't jumped on board fully with the keeping of the 5 precepts or something like that. So just because you practice Buddhist meditation doesn't mean you follow Buddhist morality. So making those kinds of distinctions as well, and trying to get a more fine-grained understanding of different kinds of meditation, how long you've been practicing them, are they practiced within a tradition or without a tradition, and are you adhering to some kind of specific ethical framework as well? And what do all those different kinds of variables, how do they influence how you morally interact in the world?
Yeah, something which sounds like it would make this research, the empirical studies, difficult is that, I mean, we've already mentioned one, the variety of meditation objects, and there are many. But then also, yeah, the way in which we hold precepts, not only the precepts that we hold, but the way in which we hold them. And I know that I've certainly had experienced myself coming to a monastery. You know, growing up in America, there's not really much, we don't really have a moral education in school that's so explicit. So I've got all sorts of ideas when I first come to the monastery about what it means to be a good monk and keep these rules. And, you know, inevitably, at least for many, people coming into a monastery, we do it in this kind of ham-handed, and, we grasp too hard over here, and then there's like a boomerang effect, and then we kind of like fall off over here. And and we kind of do the same thing in meditation as well.
I think that there's also something interesting there about an actual ethical framework as well. Having, like, as you said, maybe you come into the monastery or something like that, and you really hold on to it very, very tightly, and what that actually can do to your moral standing in the world. You might have something like a codified ethical framework that does have a very, very good intention, but if you hold to it too tightly as well, it can impact you in somewhat negative ways sometimes. If we expand the example out, say, for example, somebody that holds very fervently to the Christian Bible and the morality in that, holds very, very intensely to it, and that is says, that might say, and they might have views about sort of punishment, ways people, particular kinds of people should be punished. So it's not to say that just because you have a particular ethical framework that will make you moral in our new contexts as well. So sometimes really holding tightly to an ethical framework actually might limit you in some ways of the way that you interact. And just speaking personally here, say, for example, as monastics, we have the Vinaya, and there's things that we can't, there's things that we can't say to people, things like around our parajika rules, the rules of defeat. We can't sort of recommend for somebody to kill somebody or something like that, or we can't act as a go-between for people in relationships and things like that. So our ethical framework that we hold to maybe limits some of the ways that we can actually interact with people. So it's, and not to say that there's anything wrong with the Vinaya, but it's the ethical framework that we have limits the way that we interact with others in some ways. A lot of times it's good, but sometimes it can be limiting. So I think that's just an interesting thing as well. It's like that even the good ethical framework can limit your morality in some kinds of ways.
Right. And especially, a lot of it is due to context. I'm keeping all the rules in a strict forest monastery, and I'm praised. It's like, that's the thing to do. But then you leave the monastery and you try to, force my rules onto someone else outside of a context in which it's understood, then things can get a bit weird. So I'm curious, you mentioned prosociality as a quality pretty early in our talk, and that's something which I find quite fascinating. Obviously it's a word which you find in literature on morality in the West, certainly in modern times, but it's not necessarily like there are certain meditation objects or meditation themes in the Pali Canon especially, which actually seem to be aiming in a different direction than prosociality, like the meditation on abandonment, the Pahana Sanya,
Right,
paying
yeah.
attention to the perception of abandonment, or paying attention to these ideals of seclusion, and or meditation on asubha, or that which is unbeautiful. If
Yep.
using that to kind of cool, like a lustful, rising lust,
Mm.
and it's like by definition not pro-social.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious if you could talk about, but there is definitely a place for that. I mean, metta bhavana,
Yeah.
maybe is what the term prosociality is pointing to, this cultivation of loving kindness. So yeah, how do you hold this concept of prosociality? Do you think is it a Buddhist virtue? Is it is a qualified Buddhist virtue? Is it a human virtue which Buddhists should look more into?
So you've touched on something, and hopefully we've got enough time here. I have maybe a bit of a different view on prosociality, and so just to clarify what I mean by prosociality, what prosociality means, if you look in the cognitive science, the ethical decision making literature, the psychology literature, what prosociality means is intentions or actions. Essentially just actions that society deems are of benefit to others. Now, that's really what that's looking at, is like a specific society, what they deem to be moral, and if it's an action that aligns with helping others in that context, then that would be deemed pro-social. Now, you're right. If you look at it from a Buddhist context of what we think morality is, we not only have those actions that benefit others, but we also have mind states that benefit ourselves. As you're saying, like with something like metta bhavana, you're trying to develop a mind state within yourself to the way that you morally relate to your own thoughts. Thoughts of harm, thoughts of greed towards yourself, of maybe wanting to take something. So prosociality, I think it's only a very outward looking kind of morality, and it's limiting in its cultural and social contexts. Whereas Buddhist morality, I think it takes on a little bit more of the whole being. It takes on the individual themselves, how they relate to the way that they morally engage in the world. An example of something like this is, so for you and me, Kovilo, we have a lot of moral rules that lay people don't have to follow, and they just pertain to ourselves. How do we wear our robes? How do we, eat our food properly? We have these things that are just aimed at ourselves, that has nothing to do with anybody outside. We can only eat before 12. This has nothing to do with society. They're only aimed at themselves. So there's an aspect of Buddhist morality that really looks at the individual themselves, and then also how the individual interacts in society, in the world, and then the broader spectrum of society at large, culture at large. And so, but that's not to say that I don't think prosociality isn't a useful concept. I definitely think it is. It's the way most people understand it. I think it's a very useful thing, but I think we just sort of have to be careful with prosociality because of things like, the obvious example here is, like, just because an action is pro-social, as defined by that term, doesn't actually mean it's a moral action. Now, we can think of something like a pro-social action, donating money to a cause. Now, that might, from the outside, that might look like a pro-social action, but maybe the individual that's doing it, they're doing it, they mightn't have the best kinds of intentions for doing that. They might be doing it just to as a way to gain notoriety for themselves, or they might be doing it as a way to have a particular kind of social perception of themselves. They're not really doing it for a good reason. So I think while prosociality is useful, we do have to take a bit more of a nuanced look at what we think prosociality is, and that's and so essentially, I'll wrap up, but that's what ties into that second or third paper you were talking about. I was talking about the moral functioning framework. That's
Right.
what that tries to get at a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah, that was a concept I didn't fully understand. Yeah, a
Mm,
functional framework
mm,
of morality.
mm.
Yeah, could you explain a little bit more? And actually, before, just as an aside to everyone else, people can put in questions in the chat box, either on YouTube or on Facebook. So, and we'll answer those in just a bit. But yeah, sorry, Ajahn. Yeah. So, what is this moral functioning framework? Is this a term which you created, or is this
Yeah.
a structure which exists that you've just found to be helpful?
So it's a structure that myself and a few other co-authors, Jakob Howe in particular, also Sarah Lazar is helping me work on as well, that looks at, again, we're looking at this from a moral psychology and a moral philosophy kind of perspective. And if you look at the moral psychology literature over the past few decades, there's a lot of research into different areas of your moral cognition, your moral emotions, and your moral actions and your moral behaviors. And what you get when you look at a lot of this literature, there's different things about our moral cognition. So things like our moral intuitions, our moral judgments, our moral reasonings, our moral motivations and intentions, these kinds of factors, these kind of psychological factors that make up our moral cognition. And then we look at things like the different kinds of moral emotions we might have, compassion, guilt, shame, um, all these different kinds of specific moral emotions, and then the kinds of moral behaviors that we might have, helping behaviors, harming behaviors. So what the moral functioning framework is trying to do is, it's like what psychological science usually tries to do is separate these factors out and just look at them in isolation most of the time.
Hmm.
What we've tried to do with the moral functioning framework is gather a lot of these different factors together and put them together in one framework as a model, and essentially trying to say that if you want to look at something like meditation, morality that comes from something like meditation or a contemplative practice, you need to look at the whole of the individual's moral functioning processes, the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral processes that are there.
Hmm.
You need to look at the whole thing. Just looking at one is not going to be useful enough. I.e., if you just look at a moral behavior, that doesn't mean that the rest of their cognitions are in line with that behavior. So yeah, it's a way to put together a lot of different moving parts that is also built off a lot of ethical decision-making models, moral psychology models of moral cognition. But we sort of updated this moral functioning framework specifically to look at morality more from this kind of contemplative perspective, where we look at the whole of the individual as opposed to just these parts.
That's great. And that seems like a really useful tool. So when I hadn't really read much, or I've never seen this framework of actually looking at my moral cognition, moral emotions, moral behaviors, looking at sila. So these are all under the large umbrella in a Buddhist context of sila, or virtue, ethics, morality. But this framework really does a good job of kind of sussing out the different angles on that. I'm curious, like for myself, I definitely acknowledge, what your paper is looking at, that simply by a rote, practice of a particular meditation technique. Okay, look at the breath, just watching the breath come in and out, in and out. I mean, that is not necessarily, especially if I'm not, paying attention to it really. That's not inherently, just by definition, going to have any kind of effect on my moral emotions, cognitions, or behavior. But I do feel like when they're working, and when one is sensitive both to one's meditation object, one is, letting the mind get more clear, letting the mind become more stable. That does have a positive effect, and one can have genuine insights. This is like, or you can even use morality as a meditation object, like this sila anusati. And it also the other way around, like that, giving thought to my intentions and how I'm keeping the rules that I want to keep, whether
mm,
for me it's all the monk rules, but
mm,
just the 5 precepts, the more subtle and more energy, attention that I can give to why I'm keeping those, how I'm keeping those, how it's affecting other people, this kind of dynamic process, that also has a mutually supportive and
yeah,
uplifting effect on the meditation.
mm.
And yeah, would you, yeah, how do you speak on that? Do you touch on that in your papers about like when it is working? Um,
Yeah, so in all honesty, I don't touch on it as much in the papers, but I always put that caveat in of that personally, I have that kind of bias. I actually do think the more that you meditate, the more, it does make you a little bit more aware of your inner life in a kind of way, and knowing that these kinds of ways that I speak or think or act in the world, this is
mm,
disturbing my mind to some extent. So I need to be very,
mm,
very careful of that. I
mhm,
think it's something naturally that a lot of us that maybe just start with meditation, we start to realize the more we meditate, it's like, oh, I really need to be careful with these other things. So I do have that bias that I do think the more you do practice, it does in some kind of way like assist your morality. But I also try to be very careful with that as well, and just not leaning just into that assumption, because if you remember what I said at the start, it's like we don't have much empirical literature on it.
uh,
We have a whole tradition, like millennia of tradition, that say these things, and I generally I think they're right. I think they've got something to say there,
mm,
but we, at least from a empirical standpoint, we can't fully say that with a lot of certainty at the moment. Now, that's not to say as well that you know this is all useless unless you have some kind of empirical data. No, I'm not saying that at all. Obviously, like millennia of traditions and are very, very useful. But I'm just very, very careful of saying it with this kind of absolute certainty, because what we have a lot is millennia of anecdotal evidence.
mm,
Um, so I'm just quite careful with that. But just generally, yeah, that's what happened to me. That's what happened to me.
mm.
The more I meditated, the more I went, oh, hang on, this moral thing, that's pretty important.
Right, right. It's interesting, like, you know, this phrase, like, the more you do X, the more you meditate. I
Mm,
mean, it's not, especially if we're bumbling through it,
mm,
trying to figure out the meditation object, what it actually means to be paying
mm,
attention to a meditation object. We're trying our best, and then we're, messing up, and we
mm,
clinch down too hard on an
mm,
object or whatever.
mm,
Um, I've had a similar experience that over time, especially with a teacher or living in a community or having friends that can like
mm,
mirror,
mm.
um, yeah, it's almost like you don't even need to ask for feedback if you're
Mm.
open to it.
Yeah.
Like what I'm doing with my mind on the cushion is going to be having an effect
Mm,
have some effect, especially if one's meditating a lot,
mm,
on how one is appearing in the world.
mm,
Um, and to the extent that one's performing pro-social behaviors or not.
mm,
And yeah, I think if one is actually willing to pay attention and not just kind of take a method as doctrine and think that just by following steps 1, 2, 3,
mm.
and if it, then you're going to get results X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Um, but remaining sensitive to that, and uh, yeah, I have had similar one more piece of anecdotal
Yeah.
evidence that,
Yeah.
yeah, there is a mutually a positive feedback loop with these two,
Yeah.
morality and sitting.
And I think it's just, and the reason I like to be careful with these things is just because we also know of plenty of times where it goes wrong with meditators. There's throughout history, there's been sort of examples that people that, gurus and things like this, that do behave morally badly, but they obviously had some kind of good meditation.
Uh-huh.
So it's not that, again, this is just what interests me with these kinds of things. Is like most of the time this stuff works, but sometimes it doesn't. So what are those kinds of things where sometimes it doesn't work? And somebody that is
Mm,
practicing meditation a lot and should know the benefit of harmlessness and looking after intentions and thoughts. Like, why does that go wrong, kind of thing? So
Right.
that's a really, for me, that's a really interesting thing to look at as well. And so there's these kind of like moral, maybe like let's call them a moral monster kind of thing. But then also maybe a lot of us might know people that maybe they're not moral monsters and they've practiced meditation a lot, but maybe they do some things that are like, that's a bit off. Maybe the way they emotionally treat people or interpersonally, or it's like, that's a little bit off. So not
Dissonance.
just the massive moral monsters, but also the kinds of, there's these little ways in some people that have
Moral
actually,
munchkins. We'll call them.
yeah. It changes them in some way. So I think those kinds of things are interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And I get pretty skeptical when, I mean, there are certain Buddhist traditions even
Mm.
that like will go heavy, if not wholly, on meditation or wisdom. This is all you need. Just
Yeah.
wisdom teachings,
Mm.
don't need to worry about precepts. And that for me, like quite skeptical for the,
Yeah.
given the evidence of teachers who have done that, and then the kind of havoc that can be created in communities where that's the overarching framework. So,
Yeah.
well, should we go to some questions?
For sure.
All right.
And let me just plug my computer in because I'm about to. It's all about to die on me. So I'll let you read the question out.
All right. And I'll respond to this one too, I think. Patanjali, in his Yoga Sutra, sets out harmlessness. This had to be such in the Buddha's time, ahimsa and such. Yeah, this is definitely true. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, I think most scholars do put that historically after the time of the Buddha, and putting it after the time of the Buddha, reading it in Sanskrit, you find many Buddhist frameworks. I mean, there's mention of Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, Upeksha. So basically the 4 Brahmaviharas come up in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And certainly the concept of ahimsa or harmlessness, this is part of the second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path of right intention, which is in Pali, you get vihingsa, which is basically synonymous. So hingsa is harming, and is non-harming, which is more common in certain Sanskrit literature, and in vihingsa, which is the definition of not harming, which is what we should be aiming for with all of our thoughts on some level. So yeah, thanks. Good point. And that really is, I feel like, a beautiful basis. I mean, I feel like working from a position of harmlessness, then that's almost like, and I'm curious what you think about this, Ajahn. Do you think that harmlessness is enough of a, like if one just took harmlessness as one's key principle, is that enough to build a whole foundation or a whole system of morality off of?
Yeah, I think it's a really good starting point.
Mm-hmm.
But that you can also see counterexamples to harmlessness. What happens when aggressors actually sort of come? Like, where do you draw the line in the sand of pushing back in some kind of way? So harmlessness, obviously, most of the time is going to work. But what happens when the rest of the world isn't harmless towards somebody? So I think harmlessness is very, very useful, but it's also very, very complex in that we can't just be harmless.
Mm-hmm.
Also, and another way, like if we think about it from a cognitive perspective, if we having this sort of just be harmless all the time, maybe there's somebody that's doing something morally reprehensible, and if you're wanting to be harmless, I don't want to harm them by saying something to them, then you're actually not morally very responsible in that way.
Right.
So there's harmlessness. So sometimes being moral requires us to inflict some kind of level of harm that might be might be just, there might be something along the lines of just criticizing someone or hurting their feelings in some kind of way. So it's not always necessarily that you're totally passively harmless. But yeah, harmless, I think, is a good, like, it's definitely a better starting point than harming.
Yeah. But this gets into ethical questions. But on the larger and kind topic of harmlessness, I got questions about some animals. So
Right.
I experienced virtue and harmlessness. This is a multi-part question.
Yeah.
I experienced virtue and harmlessness as a protection. I met with a mountain lion twice, and the lion just purred to let me know it's lounging there. Coyote and foxes. Animals can smell metta in just a little bit more. Even birds in the wild know. They fly beside me for half a mile hike. Virtue is the greatest protection in the wild. Any thoughts about that, Ajahn?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's like, if you have this heart full of kindnessness and metta, like any kind of being, animals or even people, respond to that in some kind of positive way. So having good morality, I think, is a good kind of protection as well. But I'd also sort of recommend of, like, keep the precepts and also take the bear spray on the walk. So it's not not always necessarily the precepts are the only things that are going to protect you. So we have plenty of examples of in Thailand and Sri Lanka, very, very good monks getting trampled by elephants and things like this. So also be careful. I'm not going to say who the monk is, but it was one of the funniest things that I ever seen. In Australia, we have kangaroos. I don't know if anybody knows about kangaroos. Kangaroos actually, they box and they kick, and they have a very sharp spiked toe. And so if they kick you, they can actually open up your stomach. So there was a monk who had this kind of, I'm going to go and give metta, give kindness to the kangaroos. And he got up very close to them, this kangaroo just like up and kicked him in the stomach.
Wow.
So look, I think metta fantastic, but also know you're in the wild as well. Don't take unnecessary chances.
Good advice. Good advice. You can come here for naturalistic advice in addition to meditation. So yeah, I didn't know anything about kangaroos, so this is good. This is helpful. I'll take all the outback advice I can get. Let's see. Different kind of confrontation. So, hello, sirs. I'm being attacked by my neighbors by their chemical vapes and negative energy. How do I not react?
Did you want to take a stab at that?
Well, not reacting. I mean, this is, certain Buddhist teachers will actually take not reacting as a fundamental aspect of a Buddhist practice, basically learning how to watch the mind and not have to react. So that is one of the metta, M-E-T-A, like overarching skills that we're learning as we meditate, is how we don't have to react. And it's obvious when you meet with noxious things in the environment, whether that's smells or sights, bad neighbors, etc., bad energy. Who wants to be near bad energy? Who wants to smell, noxious things? But how do we not have to be slaves to our own, that almost like, for us, it's an instinct to not want to be around things we don't like. So that's part of the training, and meditation does help with that. But at the same time, of course, kindness for yourself. If it's possible to orchestrate your external environment, that's also helpful too. The Buddha didn't just say you have to get used to everybody around you and love and just bear up with every situation. It's the first several of the highest blessings in the Mangala Sutta, that avoiding those of foolish ways and associating with the wise, these are the highest blessings. So yeah, if your neighbors are doing that, do you need to live there? Do you need to interact with them? Like choosing how you orchestrate your day. What is your pattern of life? And do you have to interact with them? So avoiding, you read the Sabbasava Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 3, and there's a whole path where the Buddha acknowledges that avoiding is part of the path. It can be. There are things which you can avoid negative emotions just by avoiding certain things. So yeah, experiment and be kind to yourself, and maybe try to be kind to your neighbors as well to the extent you can. We've got a few more questions. I might turn one back to you, Ajahn.
Yeah.
Ajahn, I've become aware that the strong moral framework of my birth religion, along with the morality of Western psychology, gets mixed up with, quote, competes with Buddhist morality when I make moral decisions. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a complex one. I'd probably first ask by sort of asking for some clarification around the strong moral framework of your birth religion might actually be, and how that sometimes competes with the Buddhist morality. As a general kind of piece of general kind of thought in these kinds of areas, I think one of the biggest things we have to look at when we think about Buddhist morality is we need to obviously think of karma as well. We need to think of exactly what karma actually is these intentions and actions that lead to some kind of result. So as a general rule, we have to be really looking after our intentions and the kinds of thoughts that we have, and what kind of actions that's leading to, and the kind of results that we're getting out of that. So there is an aspect that's sort of, you could say, the heart of kind of Buddhist morality as well. It's very, very tied up to karma. So if you try to act in that way, then I'm not sure how things from different religious traditions could sort of conflict with something like that. But yeah, I'd probably just need more clarity on what you mean by how and why it's actually conflicting. And yeah,
we might see them in our Zoom session, which is quickly
right.
coming up. Maybe I'll just read one question, because I think it's a really great and useful one. And maybe we can just talk about it more in our Zoom session. So yes. So Ajahn, do you think because some traditions put a lot of emphasis on emptiness, everything is eventually empty of independent self? Is morality also empty? Some gurus take it in this sense. So yeah, this is a huge point. I mean, if one's main meditation topic is emptiness, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and just you take that to its logical extreme, then it can make you, feel like that morality just doesn't exist. There's no truth to it, and it can be quite dangerous. What are your thoughts? We have about 20 seconds. You might want to continue over on Zoom.
Again, this really ties into the kind of high teachers, high meditation, thinking that actually they are beyond morality, beyond conventional morality. I think it's a pretty dangerous thing to fall into. Keep your head in the clouds of emptiness, but keep your body and your actions in the real physical world of morality. I'd probably say that in 20 seconds.
Nice. That's great, Ajahn. I love it. I'll try to do that. Well, thanks, everyone. This has been a nice conversation. And as we've said, we'll go over to Zoom now for a more interactive conversation. The Zoom link is on the screen, but also in the chat box. And you can find that on Clear Mountain Monastery's website under the calendar. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Ajahn. Very interesting and neat conversation, useful conversation. So
thanks for facilitating and guiding me through another session as well. Ajahn Kovilo, really appreciate it.
Yeah, very enjoyable. All right, take care, everybody. And Ajahn will be again at St. Mark's Cathedral this Saturday, starting at 9:30 with meditation and another talk. And then next Wednesday, Ajahn will be back. Myself and Ajahn Nisabel are leaving this weekend to be in Thailand and then India for a pilgrimage with 30 clear mountaineers. So think of us, and we'll maybe be thinking of you, sending metta out at least. So, all right, take care, everybody. Namaskar, Ajahn.
Namaskar.